This is Laura London, and you're listening to Speaking of Jung. My guest today is Jungian analyst Brockton Hill. Mr. Hill received a Juris Doctorate from the UCLA School of Law before earning his master's degree in counseling psychology from Pacifica Graduate Institute. He then went on to receive his Jungian training, earning a diploma in analytical psychology from the Jung Institute of Los Angeles. He is currently on the faculty of the Newport Psychoanalytic Institute, serving in their training program, and lectures at the Jung Institute, where he served as president for the last 2 years and has been a training program instructor since 2010. He has lectured on Jung's 2 essays on analytical psychology, seminar on Nietzsche's Zarathustra, and the Red Book. His public lectures include Tarot as Archetypal Representation, Ariadne and Medea, Woman's Experience of Abandonment in Midlife, Psychological Defenses as Symbolized in the Horoscope, Systemic Financial Collapse, Pluto's Transit of Capricorn, and the topic of today's talk, When Worlds Collide, Psychological Astrology and Terrorism. In 2011, he appeared on a panel at the Wadsworth Theatre in Los Angeles to discuss the movie A Dangerous Method for the film series Real Talk with Stephen Farber. Mr. Hill's publications include Living in a Time of Nonsense, Lessons from Liber Primus in the Face of the Rounds of Hades, Ouroboros, a review of Jung's thinking on the nature of the psyche and the transformation of libido, and a film review of A Dangerous Method, the story of Jung, Freud, and Sabina Spielrein. He is presently a member of the Board of Directors, the Certifying Board, and the Personnel Committee at the Jung Institute of Los Angeles, as well as a former past president of the Board of Directors and a member of the Ethics Committee. From 1996 through 2005, he served as chairman and member of the Board of Directors of Pacific Clinics in Pasadena, the largest nonprofit mental health provider in the Western United States. He currently maintains private practices in Pasadena and West Los Angeles. This interview was recorded on July 5th, 2016, through the magic of Skype, and we pick up after I had asked him how he had become interested in Jung.
I'd first become interested in Jung back in college in about 1979, 1980, something like that. So I had always had an interest both in Jung, and at the same time I came across Jung, I also discovered psychological astrology as kind of put forward by Liz Green, and also discovered the Kabbalah, kind of all at the same couple of month period. So those things stayed with me all the way through undergraduate and then law school, and then as I was practicing law. And I got to about 1990, 1991, something like that. And all of a sudden, my interest in practicing just kind of evaporated very suddenly. Up until that point, law had been a challenging endeavor. I'd really enjoyed it. And then all of a sudden, over a very short period of time, it just kind of was gone. I'd actually... I was going back to Europe, where I had been maybe 10 years previously. And I almost didn't think I could make the trip because I was so busy with work. I was working on a whole series of financial transactions, and I'd gotten sick. I thought I was going to have to cancel the whole thing. I managed to make it, and then in meeting my old friends in Europe who were also professionals, I suddenly just felt very awkward and in terms of their perspective on life and what I was up to and the amount that I worked and so on. And when I came back from that trip, I was just not able to re-engage with the work the way I had previously. And I was kind of floundering around. And at some point over the next, maybe it was a few years later, I thought about, I would become a Jungian analyst. And I looked into what... to the Institute in Los Angeles and found out what I would need to do, and then I set about doing that. But I think Jung has a piece called Concerning Rebirth. I think it's in volume 9b, I'm not sure, but in it he talks about this myth or story from the Quran in which Moses and Joshua they go on a journey. And before they leave, Moses gives Joshua a fish to put in his wallet and to carry as they travel. And as they approach this spot that's described as where the two seas meet, the fish jumps out of the wallet and swims away. And Joshua doesn't realize that, and they just keep going. That night when they stop, Moses asks, okay, where's the fish? That's our dinner. And of course it's not there. So he says, well, we have to turn around and go back and find out where we left it. Mm-hmm. And they get back to this point where the two seas meet. And there, instead of the fish, is this figure called Khidr, Khidr, I believe, who is this figure from the Quran who represents this immortal figure who, very much a self figure, who is extremely wise. And from that point forward, the story is about how Moses convinces Khidr to allow him to travel with him. And that is also a very interesting piece of it. But for me, it kind of illustrates this notion of the fish or the libido, which is very much connected to the self. When that goes away, when it suddenly leaves something, you have to sort of go back and find it.
Now, by libido, you're using it the way Jung used it. And would you define that?
Well, I think for Jung, libido is desire. It's really the essence of the psyche. That whole sense of desire or will. And it's what eventually sort of transforms into an experience of the self. Mm-hmm. And so it's that desirousness in us that we really need in order to make our way in life.
I'm sorry, I interrupted your story. I just wanted to make sure that
was clear. Sure.
Yeah, that people were clear on the definition of that word and that it wasn't sexual.
Well, it certainly is sexual, but that's not all that it is. Mm-hmm. It has a lot more to it than that. Mm-hmm. I mean, for Jung, that energy is really what is his first work is Transformation of Libido, and it's all about how that very primitive fundamental energy is transformed into everything cultural, everything that comes afterwards. Mm-hmm. So it's very primal, and it's very important for us individually. So for me, there was this sense when I had been practicing law that the sense of challenge, of enjoyment, of real desire had just sort of left what I was up to, and kind of following it led me to pursue becoming an analyst. Now, if at the time someone had told me it would be another 15 years before I would actually be an analyst, it might have dissuaded me, but that's not what happened. I went to Pacifica and also got into analysis because I had not been in analysis prior to that point. And then from there had to accumulate the hours to be licensed. And that took quite some time. And so I wasn't finally licensed until 2000. And then I began the analyst training program in 2001. And finally it was certified in 2009.
What made you decide to go to Pacifica and get a master's degree before you became an analyst? Did you need that master's degree? In order to become an analyst, I had to be a licensed clinician in California. I see.
So that was and I was still practicing as an attorney. So I needed to be able to go to school someplace like Pacifica where I could do that on a 1 weekend a month basis. And then also proceed to accumulate hours. You need 3,000 hours of clinical work before you can be licensed in California. So mm-hmm. it's a long process.
It's a long process. And you decided to do your Jungian training at the C.G. Jung Institute of Los Angeles, which mm-hmm. has actually been around since the 1940s and
yes.
was founded by some of Jung's pupils, his students, mm-hmm. James mm-hmm. and Hilda Kirsch and Max Zeller.
Yes.
all refugees from Nazi Germany who were not able to stay in Zurich. And could you tell us a little bit about your experience of the Jung Institute in LA?
Well, my first experience at the Institute was in the 80s when the film A Matter of Heart was first shown in West Los Angeles. That was my first encounter with the Institute. I didn't begin attending seminars and classes there until the point when I was thinking about becoming an analyst. So that would have been about 1992 or so. And when I began at the Institute, Lori Zeller, who was Max Zeller's wife, was in the bookstore, and she had been there forever. And she was really, in many ways, kind of the heart and soul of the Institute. She was never an analyst, although I think that just prior to her retiring, she was made an honorary analyst.
Oh, wow.
And she was just so, it was a very special place to be able to go to the bookstore library and have Lori there, because she always had something very profound to say about whatever you might be researching or looking for. And so the Institute was always a place that I enjoyed for the public programs and for the bookstore library. And then I began an internship there. It must have been, well, actually, no, that's not true. My next big experience there was in 95 when I did the seminar with Dr. Edinger, actually. But
Which we'll talk about a little bit later.
Sure.
Yeah.
But I guess that it was the classes that were presented in the public programs were quite diverse, and I always found very interesting. So I always felt comfortable at the Institute. And at the time, there were not many places in the country where you could actually study to become an analyst. There was San Francisco, New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles. I don't think that the interregional had quite been formed. Possibly it had been formed at that point. But so there were not many options to study to become an analyst.
At some point, you became involved in the training program yourself at the Institute.
Well, typically what happens is as soon as you're certified, it's this lovely time where you're usually someone's home, and the certifying committee accepts you, and there's a little celebration with champagne, and then shortly thereafter, maybe 5 minutes, there will be, okay, so we have this committee we think you would be good for. So it's a pretty quick transition into some form of engagement with the Institute as an analyst, either in the either teaching in the training program or on some kind of committee work.
And you still do that now?
Yes. I'm actually now on the certifying committee, and I'm the, what's the term? The immediate past president, so I'm still on the board of directors.
And you just finished a 2-year term as president of the Institute, is that right?
Yes, I did.
What did that entail?
Well, at one point, being president of the Institute was really a great deal of work because we didn't have an executive director. There were points in time when we did have an executive director, and that takes a lot of weight off of the president. So throughout the years, it's varied in terms of how demanding it might be on the individual in that position. For myself, I'm very fortunate in that our executive director, Christoph Lemuel, has been on board for quite some time, and he's just really does some very amazing work. So as president of the Institute, it really means that I'm kind of the person who looks over his shoulder and make sure that we keep on track and run the board meetings. And it's not quite as day-to-day as it might have been in the past.
Right. Well, I wanted to talk to you today about a recent presentation that you did, I believe, at the Institute called When Worlds Collide, Psychological Astrology and Terrorism. But I think first we should give some background on that because you attended, as you mentioned a minute ago, Edward Edinger's series of lectures that he gave at the Institute on what he called the archetype of the apocalypse. And those 10 weekly lectures were edited and made into a book by the same name, Archetype of the Apocalypse, Divine Vengeance, Terrorism, and the End of the World.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd first heard of that book when I interviewed Frith Luton back in episode 3. I had not heard of it, and I didn't have the book, and I just kind of kept it in the back of my mind. I thought, wow, that kind of is very timely, and I should, have somebody talk about that. I had heard that you had given this talk. Was it sort of based on this book?
No, actually, it wasn't at all. I had the topic had kind of come up for me in the fall in terms of thinking about the psychological astrology of terrorism. And Wendy McGinty, who runs our public programs, asked me to do something on it in the late spring. And so that's what I came up with. And so I was really focused on the kind of the astrological significators, I suppose. But certainly what I came up with and what I got to very much dovetails in with Dr. Edinger's work. As I was saying, when the book came out in 1999, I bought it, but I did not read it because I was in the middle of the training program and other things, and I had just finished taking the seminar a few years earlier. So I've now reviewed it, and it really is a very profound work that I don't think many of us who were in the seminar, I'm sure not many of us could have appreciated just how timely it was and how prescient it was.
Yeah, I just would like to say, for those people who might not know who Edinger was, he was considered kind of the dean of Jungian analysts in the United States. And it says in the beginning of the book, in the preface, which was written by George Elder, he said that Edinger found his conventional career as a physician meaningless, just as he had already found unsatisfying his early upbringing as a Jehovah's Witness. His analyst was M. Esther Harding, and they had both founded the Jung Institute of New York, and then Edinger made his way to Los Angeles. So what was your experience of him?
Well, I've been through undergraduate and law school and Pacifica and a lot of seminars in the training program, but there was never an experience for or since like his seminars. And from what people told me, the seminar he did on the apocalypse was very much the tenor and tone of those that had gone before. I think he actually might have done one or two after, but very serious. He would arrive with a lot of material that he wanted to get to. And my sense is that he did not, the books that were published were typically transcripts of seminars like this that he had done. Mm-hmm. So when he was presenting this material, it was material that he was really intending to end up in book form. And so he really had a sense of what it was he wanted to talk about. There was not a lot of interaction with the group. Typically, you could leave questions at the end of the seminar that he might consider the following week. But there was not a lot of interaction because there was a real focus. And the seminar was packed, and it was, I think it was a lot for people to take in. I think it would actually have been difficult for people to have a lot of questions because the material was so complex and difficult.
There's a quote here which I was really surprised by, and I tweeted it, and it got a really big response. In the book, it says, Edinger is following up on the insights of Jung, who wrote concerning the symbolism of the world's end, quote, the coming of the Antichrist is not just a prophetic prediction. It is an inexorable psychological law. What on earth does that mean?
Well, I think that one problem of approaching that book the archetype of the apocalypse and then references to Revelation is that we all have some feelings about religion in general and Christianity in particular. And those words, apocalypse, revelation, end of the world, it brings up quite an antichrist, brings up a very strong reaction in us based on our own history. I think that both Jung and Edinger are trying to get around that that immediate reaction to get to something a little deeper. So that, for instance, the notion of Antichrist for Jung is not kind of the image of the devil that we kind of associate with that from the Book of Revelation. It's rather the sense of materialism.
Okay.
So for Jung, this is rooted in Jung's work Ion, which was published in the late 40s. And in it, he really kind of psychoanalyzes the last 2,000 years of history, which he identifies as being the Christian Ion. And it comes from the notion in astrology that the equinox moves over time. It takes about 2,000 years to move through a particular sign for about a 27,000 year rotation. So the era immediately preceding what's come to be known the Christian era was that of Aries. And it very much was about conquest and all of those things that we associate with Aries and the ram. And then the advent of Pisces was quite different. And so for Jung and Ion, he examines it in terms of the symbolism of the sign Pisces. And the Pisces is a sign of two fish kind of swimming away from one another. And he looked at the first 1,000 years of that Ion as being related to the figure of Christ as he appears in the New Testament as this redeeming figure of love and the incarnation of the Yahweh of the Old Testament. And then in the second 1,000 years, that's the time of the Antichrist. And for Jung, that's kind of a literal sense of the opposite of Christ, which during that first 1,000 years, there was this supreme emphasis on spirituality and moving away from all things having to do with the body.
Okay.
And then in the second 1,000 years, there was this movement back towards the consideration of matter, the development of science, of capitalism, of all of the various isms, the kind of the moving away from the spiritual down to the material. So when Jung is talking about the Antichrist, he's talking about everything having to do with materiality. The body, the science, the focus on the concrete and the real and the everyday as opposed to the spiritual. So that is how Jung is looking at that term Antichrist. And Edinger kind of picks that up. And then in addition to Ion, he goes on to write further about it in Answer to Job. And then finally in the Undiscovered Self is the third essay, which Edinger considers kind of sum up Jung's view on sort of this transformation of the God image from the image of God that prevailed during that 2,000-year cycle of Pisces, as it's going to transform into whatever that image will be as we go into the next Ion, which is the Ion of Aquarius. So that is what essentially Jung is saying, that it's inexorable that this is going to happen because it's about the transformation of the human psyche.
And are we in the age of Aquarius now?
Well, that's open to argument. In Jung's book Ion, I believe that the later dates he gave were something like 1997, 1996. Again, he's writing this in the mid-40s.
Right.
There are astrologers who will put the date as anywhere up until like 150 years from now, like
Right.
2160 or
Yeah.
something like that. So the issue is that there is no strong demarcation up there in the heavens between Pisces and Aquarius in terms of where that transition is. So there's disagreement as to when that might be. For me personally, I've always felt that with the discovery of Uranus in the late
Yes.
18th century, that really marked, because Uranus rules Aquarius, and from that point forward, with the Age of Reason and the revolutions here and in France, and just the Industrial Revolution, all of the big changes that really became, they'd been building and kind of showing up through the scientific revolution and alchemy and all of the Reformation, all these different changes. But really with the Age of Reason, the French Revolution, the Industrial Revolution, things really sped up dramatically. And it's just continued to go in that direction. So are we, where are we? I think that we're certainly in an age of transition, whether we're transitioning at the, into the beginning of Aquarius or at the end of Pisces. There's still this sense of quite a transition happening.
Yes, and so the book is about the apocalypse, and Edinger says that the question that really concerns him is, what does the apocalypse mean psychologically?
Mm-hmm.
And that his answer is that it means the momentous event of the coming of the self into conscious realization.
Mm-hmm.
And that it is a momentous event, literally world-shattering.
Yes.
That's what the content of the apocalypse archetype presents, the shattering of the world as it has been, followed by its reconstitution.
Yes.
So that's sort of where we are now. And would you say that we're in it? We're going through it?
Well, we're going through some, it can always feel like whatever time we happen to be living in is the most upsetting.
Yeah,
or
right.
But we don't have to look too far back in history to find other times. I mean, the whole, as Edinger talks about, the whole notion of the end of the world, it's come up at the end of every century since 1,000 years ago. Every century was going to be the end of the world. So what human beings have had to struggle with in terms of plagues and wars and natural disasters, that sense of everything coming to an end is always present. It's always there. Whether this time is worse or not is arguable. We certainly, because of the mass communication, we certainly are much more aware of all of the tragedies and difficulties of the world. It's wherever it might be happening, we're confronted with it. But it's hard. Jung had this statement about, he asked the question, who discovered water? And he said, well, I don't know, but it wasn't a fish. Because a fish is in the water. So that's where we are. We're in it. And it's hard to have a true perspective on what is happening objectively. But it certainly does feel like it's very transformational. And as Edinger talked about the term, it's certainly applicable to individuals when we come into experience of the self, because it's going to be the experience of everything. What erupts is everything of which that we have not ascribed to the self, all of the dark side of the self, whatever that might be for us. It's the opposites, because the self for Jung is this combination of, it's a wholeness of opposites. And so having to tolerate these aspects of the self that have not been in consciousness, that we've not considered to be part of our awareness, is always going to be an apocalypse, a revelation.
How is the apocalypse an archetype? What does that mean?
Well, it's in the beginning of that book, Edinger gives a good definition. I don't have it handy, but the focus is on a pattern some kind of pattern of behavior that pre-exists in the human psyche.
Yeah, he calls it an ancient pre-existent pattern of the psyche.
Yes. And so that, and just as we were talking about the sense that throughout history, whenever we are challenged by something that confronts us, that challenges our sense of the world as we know it, that's an archetype. The sense of something that's overwhelming, it's going to undermine us. Our whole world is going to change overnight. That has been a human experience from the beginning. That suddenly, from whatever source, the world as we know it could change or end. So it's very much rooted in us, and therefore it can be very challenging to identify when it's happening truly on a global scale, or is this just happening to me, or is this happening to a part of the world? You know, what does this really mean?
So would you tell us a little bit about the concept of being possessed by an archetype? Because Edinger says that it's always the passionate intensity that reveals the possession by an archetype. What does that mean?
Well, I think he uses this imagery of giants or angels coming down from heaven and devouring men. And this is an image of some kind of archetypal pattern devouring us. And the issue is always, are we going to be eaten by the archetype, or are we going to eat it? Meaning, is it going to assimilate us to it, or are we going to assimilate it to us, the ego? Are we going to be able to eat enough of it that it becomes conscious, as opposed to something that runs us? So the whole, there's a passage that Edinger quotes in his book from Matthew about the revelation or the coming again of Christ, in which it's all based on the notion that how we treat others is a reflection of how we are treating Christ. And if we treat others well, we will be redeemed and taken up into heaven. And if we treat others poorly, essentially we will be treating God or the Christ or the self poorly, and we will go down into hell. And that is very much an image of selflessness, and it's very congruent with Pisces, and particularly Pisces as a feeling sign, a feeling nature. So they're very much values of feeling, very very much about selflessness. So one of the pieces that comes up in the that would be ascribed to the Antichrist is selfishness, the focus on oneself at the expense of others. And so to the degree that archetype erupts, so if we can imagine through this period of the Piscean age, selfishness is not considered a value, and it's really kind of suppressed into the unconscious. So when that erupts later on, we can become possessed by it. We can become possessed by the notion of selfishness. I think some of the focus now on narcissistic personality disorder, that seems to be sort of a rampaging diagnosis at this point.
Yes, I've noticed that.
That can be seen as sort of this being possessed by the archetype of selfishness, that it's not something that we've been able to eat ourselves, to integrate the notion that, yes, we want to do unto others, but we also want to do unto ourselves in a way that's positive and self-affirming and in a balanced fashion of both caring for others and caring for ourselves, to be able to sort of eat that archetype of selfishness, to integrate it in a way that's made conscious, as opposed to being possessed by it. So that is my way of kind of looking at the way that Edinger talks about being, are we possessed by an archetype, or is it something that we can eat, that we can integrate into a human form?
So, what are ways that we can integrate things instead of being possessed by them? What does that take?
It's challenging, depending on what it is that comes up. Certainly, sexuality is one that is particularly challenging because it is something that to come into relationship to our own sexuality in a way that does not possess us, that we're actually able to possess in a way that's human, that allows us to relate to others in a related human fashion and not to be in relationship to others as kind of objects of our sexuality, which is really sort of possessing us in that state. So it takes attempting to stop and reflect on what it is that we're doing. Certainly, any sort of work we can do with the unconscious in terms of dream work will typically help us recognize how we might be threatened with possession and what the antidote might be to that.
Mm-hmm. Edinger outlines the four aspects of the apocalypse: revelation, judgment, destruction or punishment, and a new world. He says that the four aspects of apocalyptic literature also apply to individual manifestation, right? So there are psychological correlates to these four things. And would you speak a little bit about that?
Well, typically the revelation, the first piece that he talks about, is the coming into awareness of something in our life that is typically a defeat of some sort, some experience where how we imagine ourselves in the world is challenged.
Okay.
And that could come up. It can come up from the unconscious, or it can come up in outer experience. Then the piece on judgment is the experience, really, as he goes into great detail, of being seen, this image of the I that is following us and that is watching us. And that is an image of an other, that there's this sense of going from the state of being in the world from the perspective of the ego to suddenly having a sense of there's something else, there's some other that is watching us, that's judging us, that's holding us accountable.
Now, could I just ask you, is that, I see the symbol of this all-seeing eye. I see that a lot. I'm seeing it more and more. Does that fall into this as far
Absolutely.
as it's something other than ourselves in the form of our egos? It's something other, but it's not outside of us? Is that what you're saying?
Yes, that it's actually typically, obviously in a paranoid projection, it's something that we imagine is somebody is actually watching us.
Yeah.
But that is a manifestation of the same sense of being seen or judged or watched. It's this projection of the autonomous psyche into the world. If we're able to contain it within our own consciousness, it's this awareness of feeling watched and of dreams of being seen that way, dreams of cameras. And people will dream about being in some situation where there's a camera watching them in a public place or otherwise. And obviously the outer trigger would be something to do with the government watching me or spying on me. But if we delve into it, it can be this sense that somehow that there's this other subject outside of myself, within my psyche, that's watching and judging me.
I see. Right.
And then the next, after, let's see, it's revelation, judgment, destruction.
Destruction or punishment?
Destruction and punishment. And typically that can be the experience when we're going through an analysis or some other process that constellates the self, of having all of how we've seen the world just kind of crumble.
Yeah.
As far as our structures of what we believed in, what we counted on, just our assumptions about how things worked. having that just kind of come apart, whether it's literally or it's just psychologically, that we just come to doubt so much that we took for granted. And it's a very trying period of time to go through, because there's no sense of how long it will last or what we will be left with. I think there's something in Jung's Mysterium Conjunctionis where he asks the question, what is holding me up when all visible means of support are gone? And that's kind of that getting to sort of that place of rubble, where what is actually holding me up now that there's just this landscape of nothing.
And how does the punishment come in? Who is the punisher? Is it us?
Well, it's the punisher is our own, well, it can be sort of our own sense of guilt. It can be projected into some sense, dreams of actually something pursuing us, punishing us. There's a wonderful poem that Edinger would quote at times about being pursued by the hounds of hell. I can't recall who was the author of that, but it's this image of being pursued, and of eventually we're caught, and kind of what catches us is this self, this much larger personality. And depending on how strong the ego is, that can either be overwhelming, or it can be coming into relationship with something larger.
And then the coming of a new world.
Yes, and that's the experience of kind of how, what opens up afterwards when there's been such a transformation of what are the new values.
But that's just potential, though, right? Because could we stop after this third phase, this destruction or punishment, and just kind of, that's it, we're done?
That would be a very difficult place to live in for an extended period of time. But
well,
I'm sure
it could kill people, couldn't it?
Absolutely. It can be absolutely overwhelming and incapacitate us in some fashion. Yes. So
the coming of the new world is if we make it that far.
Yes, absolutely, if we make it that far.
And it's about becoming conscious and having a relationship with the self and becoming whole. Is that what the new world is?
Yes, and I don't know that it would be a one-time ending phenomena. I think that it tends to be more sort of a kind of an ever-enlarging kind of experience where there's a little bit more that's bit off and assimilated. Both Jung and Edinger refer to this image of the messianic banquet at the end of time that shows up a lot in Jewish legend. Of at the end of time there will be this banquet on which the elect or the chosen or everyone, it's not clear, will feast on the bodies of Behemoth and Leviathan, the great serpent and the great land animal. And it's this image of kind of, again, assimilating this very dark primordial aspect of the psyche, and we can only bite off so much of that at a time. And so this whole process of revelation is something that may happen many more times than once. And
he also mentions the emergence of certain images in this aspect, the mandala, which is a circle, and the quaternity, which is an aspect of 4. So is that because they represent wholeness that they come up?
Well, both the quaternity is an image of wholeness on the level of earth, or the level of concrete reality.
Okay.
The image of the cube, of the square, of the cross, are images of the earth. They're also images of in terms of astrology, images of Saturn, of kind of concrete reality.
Yes.
So that cross or square is an image of wholeness on the physical embodied level, whereas a circle is an image of wholeness on the level of spirit. So when you put those together, it's really the bringing together of spirit and matter, of kind of the two ends of the psyche of spirit and instinct actually being held together within the consciousness of an individual.
Mm-hmm.
And that the mandala can be very helpful in giving us something, giving us a reference point for trying to hold those very different aspects of the psyche together.
And that's the new world. So, how did this figure into the talk? I'd like for you to speak to us about the talk you gave, When Worlds Collide, Psychological Astrology and Terrorism.
Mm-hmm.
You focused on the outer planets, the transpersonal planets, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto.
Yes.
And tell us a little bit about your talk.
Well, when I began this, I was a few years ago in 2008, I'd given a talk and then later a paper that you referenced on living in a time of nonsense, which looked at how at the time that Jung worked on the Red Book and just prior to World War I, this was the time when the planet Pluto moved into the sign Cancer. Now, at the time, Pluto had not yet been discovered, but in retrospect, that was when Pluto entered Cancer, and it stayed there until just a few months prior to Hitler's invasion of Poland in 1939. And during that time of Pluto in Cancer, there was this real challenge to everything having to do with Cancer has to do with the mother. It's the fourth house of the zodiac. And during that period of time, everything having to do with identity, security, home, was severely challenged. Nation states were blown up. The whole sense of how the world worked was really brought into question very severely. And that in that talk, it was focused on that through Jung's work that he did that prompted the Red Book. He was able to kind of struggle with those issues prior to them manifesting in the world in the form of World War I and everything that came in the interwar years. Now, if we fast forward to 2008, Pluto at that point was entering Capricorn, which is the 10th house of the zodiac, and it represents the father.
And it's the sign opposite Cancer, right?
Exactly. So it's going from the mother. So during Jung's time, it was challenging everything having to do with mother, containment, nurturing, identity, to father. And so everything having to do with authority, just how the world is structured, how any embodiment of authority would likely be severely challenged. And that's kind of what we've witnessed over the last 8 years since it entered Capricorn. Now, at the same time, both in Jung's time, well, actually just at the time that Hitler came to power in 1931 or 32, Uranus was in Aries, squaring Pluto in Cancer. And now, currently, we have Pluto in Capricorn with Uranus again in Aries, squaring Pluto. So you get these same very challenging, conflictual positions of Uranus having to do with rapid change, technological advance, just these mercurial rapid changes in all forms of society, conflicting with the insecurities that are going to be brought about as a result of all of these challenges to authority. So when I first began this talk about When Worlds Collide and the psychological astrology and terrorism, my thinking was that that's basically what I would be talking about. And then also throw into that mix the fact that you have the, it's not a planet, but the object Chiron.
Yes.
Which is in Pisces. and it's in an inconjunct relationship to Uranus, which is a kind of a very uncomfortable, awkward relationship between the two. And Chiron has to do with our woundedness, and it's in the sign of Pisces, which has to do with our feeling relationship, our sense of self-sacrifice, our sense of victimhood. So my initial thoughts were that these overall, with Uranus, I really see this image of progress and development that's happening so rapidly in the West, in terms of technology in particular, that life economically, financially, technologically is just changing so rapidly that it really produces a lot of stresses in terms of just how we think about our world, how our world is ordered. That Capricornian sense of this is how things work. This is my position. This is my relationship to others, and it's something that I can kind of depend on. And even if I feel I'm in a lower position to others, at least I know what my position is. But with Pluto coming through and challenging all of that, and then having that in conflict with this Uranian rapid advance, it brings up a lot of uncertainty, anxiety, fear, that manifests in many different ways. We can certainly see it in the West, in our country. But in other parts of the world that are in a position such as the Middle East, which are really still very much living in the Piscean age. And this is where my talk began to change a little bit as I worked on it, was this recognition that in many ways, when you look at the history of the Middle East, and particularly when you look at the Ottoman Empire and how it probably in about 1500 or so was certainly equal to the West, if not superior technologically and otherwise. Since that period, it just did not keep up. It really kind of stayed in really the same position it had been in for some 500 years as the West advanced just exponentially. So in many respects, the world of the Middle East really is still carrying that very Piscean sense of values, the focus on relationships being very important. What I referenced earlier about that quote from Matthew about caring for others and the values of relationship and care for others being superior to those of selfishness. The Middle East still very much carries that. So even though this conflict between the Middle East and the West has been kind of portrayed as a conflict of civilizations, I think it's more this conflict of ages almost, or psychological states, that the kind of the state of the Middle East is very much a state of people living in a Piscean era. I was fortunate enough to spend a good bit of time in Egypt, Israel, and Turkey back in 1980, 81 or so. And at that point, I'm sure it's changed drastically since then, but to be in Cairo was really like stepping back into the 15th century Europe or something. And the way that people would treat you, they would almost kind of give you the shirt off their back. It was very much this sense of relationship. And there's a tremendous ignorance about the feminine, for instance, about the reality of women on the part of men in the Middle East. And they had a whole string of experiences kind of demonstrating that. And I think that that's very much the way Europe was, say, 500 years ago. And so in many ways, there's this kind of conflict between this sort of Aquarian sense of value, which is more focused on the individual, on technology, on rationality in particular, because you're moving from a sign of feeling in Pisces to a sign of thinking in Aquarius. And all of the different, we can really look at astrological signs as all of the fire signs being intuitive, all of the water signs being feeling, all of the all of the air signs being thinking, and the earth signs being much more about sensation, if we want to think about it typologically.
Mm-hmm.
And when you move from, say, moving from Aries, of fire or sign of intuition, to Pisces, a sign of feeling or water, the transition is not nearly as abrupt or difficult as going from Pisces, the sign of feeling, to Aquarius, a sign of thinking.
Mm-hmm.
And you see that conflict, for instance, when you go from the age of reason to romanticism, that reaction of the feeling reaction of romanticism to the thinking values of the age of reason. And you see this back and forth through the development of the Western psyche. A lot of that back and forth, that development, really was foreclosed in the Middle East, in the Ottoman Empire, in kind of how life is experienced there. So now there's this abrupt conflict between values of relationship, community, feeling, and these much more thinking values that we hold today in the West. So that was kind of the essence of the talk, was that this is kind of a manifestation. And the terrorism part comes in because, again, when you come from that very, Pisces is a sign of self-sacrifice, so and the martyr. So you have that as kind of an overriding ethos or value, and then you throw into it just the terrible sense of just not having a place in the world, in terms of the values that you hold no longer mattering, or no longer having a way for them to be defended. This tremendous wounding that occurs, and the reaction can be this tremendous rage that manifests in some sort of suicidal action that kills others. Mm-hmm. So this blowing ourselves up image. I was reading an article recently in which the struggles in the Middle East were looked at from the kind of the street level view. And one story was given of this young man who, in the Egyptian revolution of a few years past, he had been a spokesman, and he was a very liberal-oriented young man who really supported the ideas of democracy and, liberal political philosophy. However, as a result of everything going south in Egypt and having that whole dream kind of squashed, he ended up as a suicide bomber who killed himself for ISIS in Syria not too long ago. Mm. So it's someone who went from this place of hope and trying to bring about significant change in his culture, in his land, in his country, mm-hmm. To someone who really was full of so much rage as to commit that kind of an act, because it is this very rageful act. It's this combination of rage and self-sacrifice, in that image of kind of a suicide bomber. Mm-hmm. And so that was kind of I guess the gist of where I was coming from in that talk.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to finish by having you tell us a little bit about your thoughts on the movie A Dangerous Method. Back in 2011, you were on Real Talk with Stephen Farber. I think you were part of a panel mm-hmm. in Los Angeles, and I had been asked myself to talk about that movie on a podcast called No Totally. And, it was just my take, just my opinion. And I like to hear others, Jungians, what their take on that movie was, because it was a Hollywood movie. It was a David Cronenberg film with big stars in it. And it portrayed the lives of Freud, Jung, and Sabine Spielrein. And I think a lot of artistic license was taken with the story. And I'd like to hear what you have to say about it.
Well, I had an interesting experience with that. Probably 6 months or so before the movie was released, I had really become interested in the Freud Jung letters.
Oh,
And
yeah.
so I began reading them, and then I came across the material about Sabina Spielrein. And actually, no, I should say that in an ethics course at the Institute, it might have been at the same time or maybe a year prior. I think it must have been a couple of years prior. We had watched a film about Sabina Spielrein. Probably a few months after that, I had picked up the volume by Caruto, I believe his name is, who it is a collection of the journals of Sabina Spielrein that were found in what had been her apartment in
Yes,
Geneva, I
right,
believe.
right.
So I had looked at all of that material, and then I had come across Sabina Spielrein, Forgotten Pioneer of Psychoanalysis, which is edited by Colleen Covington. And so I was kind of in the midst of all of that material when the movie came out. So I obviously had an opinion about the relationship and so forth. And I was on the board at the Institute, and we were invited to attend a premiere of it. And I went without high expectations, but I actually really enjoyed the movie a lot. I thought that it really, and not that it's not a, there's much of it that's straight out of his notes. Another thing that came to light were his notes of her case that are at the Burgerholze Hospital in Zurich. And much of that beginning of the movie is straight out of those notes. And I know that at the time that it was made, there was a lot of criticism of how that was portrayed, and that it was kind of a little over the top, but it was actually very much reflective of what was in the notes that Jung took of the case.
Okay.
So very much of the movie is kind of a putting into dialogue form a lot of what went back and forth between these three individuals in their letters to one another. And I think that is all very well done. The issue in the film about Jung and Sabina Spielrein's relationship sexually is not true or accurate from the best evidence. I think it's hard for us at this point in a post-Freudian world to imagine that two people could be as intimate as Jung and Sabina Spielrein were and not have that be a sexual relationship. It's hard for us to go back to what it would have been like for a young unmarried woman at the beginning of the 19th century to have had a sexual relationship with a man in terms of what that would have cost her. And it's very clear in her journals that she had considered, well, why don't I just have sex with him? So at least I'll end up with a baby. At least, but then her concern was, well, what if I don't end up with a baby? Then I won't have that. Plus, I will have lost him as my friend. And then there's additional correspondence that she had with her mother about the affair, and her mother's advice about how, she was very fortunate to have this special relationship, but that obviously having it become sexual would just be a disaster. So that piece I don't think is accurate. But in terms of trying to communicate the relationship to us now, it would be very difficult to portray it in a way that was not sexual, because that's just something that I think we've come to assume.
Yes.
And the piece of the sadomasochistic aspect of it, I certainly don't think there's any basis in the material for that. But again, it brings out this quality of the relationship that I think, again, would be difficult to portray otherwise.
I see. Yeah.
So as it's kind of, I refer to it in the paper that I did on A Time of Nonsense, looking at Jung in the way that Jung related his experiences before the war to the war itself, and that his experiences as they were portrayed were not an exact mirror of the war literally, but symbolically and metaphorically they were. And I think that that's how I kind of see that film. is that it captures metaphorically the dynamics of that relationship. And it also captures kind of how Jung became Jung, in the sense that we probably don't appreciate how his situation in Zurich was actually quite limited. We don't realize that at that point in time, if you were a psychiatrist in Zurich, you couldn't just pick up and move to Berlin or Austria or France or England and teach at a university or start a practice. It was very difficult. His the foremost psychiatric hospital in the world was the Burgerholzsee. The person in charge of the Burgerholzsee was not going anywhere. He was the number 2 there. Jung was, and he was not going to be able. Bleuler was his superior, and the way that the University of Zurich worked, which is where Jung was also a lecturer, is that he really wanted to become head of the psychiatric or psychology department at the university, but those two positions were tied together. The head of the Burgerholzsee and the head of the psychiatric department at the university were one and the same. So for someone like Jung, there was really nowhere to go in terms of his moving forward in his career in sort of a logical manner. So his withdrawing from the Burgerholzsee and from his lectureship and from his connection to Freud and being the president of the International Psychoanalytic Association was really he really did that in order to kind of really become who he became, to begin go in this whole other very independent direction that was unconnected to any kind of academic or professional foundation. And that film I think really captures that movement that he goes through over the course of that period in his life. So I enjoyed it.
Oh, that's wonderful. And it's very interesting to hear the different takes on the film, and I appreciate hearing yours. I was wondering, Brock, if you had any upcoming talks that you'd like to tell us about?
I do, actually. I have one coming up in October, also at the Institute.
Okay.
And it's on the sacred mystery of election, sanctity of choice and of the chosen. And what I'm planning to talk about is what it is that we do when we elect or choose or cast a vote. Kind of psychologically, and what's the whole history of the vote or of electing. As we were talking earlier about Edinger's book on the archetype of the apocalypse, he talks quite a bit about the image of the anointed or the chosen. And originally that was the way in which the king or the leader was chosen, was by God in some fashion. Through somehow the chosen was then anointed, and the whole image of anointment really meant the chosen or the elected. And what it is that we're doing when someone is elected is that they're being chosen to elect, to choose, to make decisions. That it's the power of choice or decision that's being conveyed on initially the king. And then over time, that whole who it was that did the electing went from a priest or some figure connected in some fashion to God, to then it became hereditary. So it was by the connection via family to the previous king or ruler. And over time, the body of who did the electing slowly began to change. But it changed probably most clearly in the history of England. But there was this slow devolution of the power of electing to some elite body, and that elite body, that special body, slowly increased until eventually you get to where we are today, where in most countries there's some sort of election by individual citizens, some sort of casting a vote or making an election. And in that, it kind of, as you know, with Edinger talking about the image of the Godhead and the dark and the light side of God, we can, both Jung and Edinger focus on sort of the selfish aspect of Yahweh, the way in which he very much focused on what he desired and what he wanted. He was a very jealous God, very self-centered, we could say. And then this Christ side of God is the very loving, self-sacrificing aspect. And so both of those kind of go together to form the image of the Godhead as it existed in the Judeo-Christian ion. So we come down to this period of time now when we elect, we tend to do it based on self-interest. We tend to do it based on, that's if we look at political theory and economic theory, it's all, the value is self-interest, and it's assumed that people are going to make choices based on self-interest. And that certainly is a piece of the self, but this other piece of selflessness, or the sense of the importance of community, or what it is that I'm doing that has a kind of a larger piece to it, that can get lost in terms of when we vote. So the talk is about that whole the psychology of what does it mean to vote, and what does it mean not to vote. In many respects, we could say that's kind of a deflation of almost feeling like I'm not good enough. I'm not elect enough to choose or to cast a ballot. So those are some of the things that I'm hoping to explore in this talk.
Wonderful. And I'll have a link to that on the website, speakingofjung.com, if anybody's interested in attending. It's a public talk, yes?
That's correct.
Okay,
yes.
Great. Thank you so much for your time today, Brock. Really appreciate you being part of Speaking of Jung.
Well, thank you very much, Laura, for having me.
You're so welcome. I'd like to thank Mr. Hill once again for agreeing to be recorded for this podcast. Please visit the website speakingofjung.com for more information about the topics that were mentioned today. There you'll also find all of the previous episodes of this podcast, which are available to listen to or to download for free. This podcast is also available on iTunes, Stitcher, and now on Google Play Music. With special thanks to Peter Stewart Lackinen, this is Laura London, and you've been listening to Speaking of Jung.